It was called the city protected by God. For 800 years, that name held. 8 centuries of siege engines, battering rams, catapults, and armies that stretched from horizon to horizon. And still the walls of Constantinople stood. The Sassanid Persians tried and failed. The Arabs besieged it twice and were turned back both times. The Bulgars came, the Rus came, the Crusaders came, and the Crusaders, shamefully, actually breached it once, not as enemies from outside, but as supposed allies who turned on their hosts. Yet even that wound healed. The city endured. The walls endured. They were not ordinary walls. The Theodosian walls, built in 413 AD under the Emperor Theodosius II, were an engineering marvel of the ancient world. A triple-layered system, an outer wall, a higher inner wall, and a deep moat running along the land side. The sea walls wrapped the city like arms around a treasure. Generals looked at those walls and calculated the arithmetic of conquest and concluded, impossible. Not difficult, not costly, impossible. And so the Byzantine Empire lived on long after its western half had crumbled. Rome itself fell in 476 AD. The Senate was dissolved. The last Western emperor, a teenager named Romulus Augustulus, was deposed without ceremony by a Germanic chieftain who didn't even bother to take the imperial title. The Western Roman Empire was so hollowed out by then that it wasn't worth the name. But Constantinople survived. The Eastern Roman Empire, which history would call the Byzantine Empire, held on. For 1,000 years after Rome fell in the West, Constantinople stood in the East as the beating heart of Roman civilization, of Orthodox Christianity, of trade and philosophy and art and law. 1,000 years. It seemed it would stand forever. Somewhere in the dusty bazaars of 7th century Arabia, in a city that Constantinople's emperors would have considered provincial and irrelevant, a man was speaking. His name was Muhammad, the son of Abdullah, of the tribe of Quraysh. He was a merchant's son, a shepherd in his youth, a man known by his community as Al-Amin, the trustworthy, long before any claim of prophethood. He was not a general. He had no empire. He had no siege weapons, no engineers, no maps of Constantinople's defenses. He had never seen its walls. And yet he spoke about those walls. He spoke about what would happen to them. And the words he left behind, recorded, preserved, transmitted across generations, described a future that seemed, to everyone who heard it, impossible. You will conquer Constantinople. Blessed is the commander, and blessed is the army. Then you will conquer Rome. Blessed is the commander, and blessed is the army. Musnad Ahmad, recorded in the 7 CE, 2 cities, 2 conquests, both named, both specific, both, at the time of the prophecy, residing safely behind what seemed like impenetrable defenses. He said both would fall. The first one did. May 29th, 1453. Sultan Mehmed II was 21 years old. His courtiers had told him it couldn't be done. Ottoman forces had tried to take Constantinople before. His own great-uncle Bayezid I had besieged it for years and failed. The walls were simply too strong, the sea approaches too well defended, the Byzantine defenders too experienced. Mehmed had a different idea. He commissioned the largest cannons the world had ever seen, including a monster called the Basilica, so enormous it required 60 oxen and 400 men just to move it into position. He dragged 70 ships overland, bypassing the chain the Byzantines had stretched across the Golden Horn. He built a rolling castle, a wheeled siege tower that could be pushed up to the walls themselves. He was methodical, meticulous, patient. He was also, according to the historians of his own time, acutely aware of the prophecy. The Byzantine Emperor Constantine XI, the last emperor, the man who would die defending his city, knew what was coming. He reportedly asked his advisors, "Is there any hope?" His Venetian allies promised ships that never arrived. His Genoese allies sent a small force. The Pope in Rome promised a crusade that was still being debated when the walls finally broke. No help came. On the morning of May 29th, after 53 days of siege, after the great cannons had pounded sections of the Theodosian walls into rubble, after a night assault had found a small gate left unlocked by a garrison too exhausted and depleted to maintain every post, Ottoman soldiers poured through the breach. Constantine XI threw off his imperial regalia, picked up a sword, and charged into the fighting. His body was never found. The last emperor of Rome died in the ruins of the city his ancestors had built. Mehmed rode into Constantinople on a white horse. He dismounted at the Hagia Sophia, the greatest church in Christendom, the Church of Holy Wisdom, whose dome had dominated the city's skyline for 900 years, and he pressed his forehead to the ground in prayer. The Eastern Roman Empire was over. The first prophecy was fulfilled. 800 years of the impossible ended in a single morning. The commander was blessed. The army was blessed, exactly as the Prophet Muhammad had said. The second city. What does Rome mean? So, Constantinople fell. The first half of the prophecy is history. It is stone and record and settled fact. You can stand in modern Istanbul, the city that rose from Constantinople's ruins, and touch the stones of the walls that Mehmed broke through. The prophecy is not abstract. It is geography. But the second half of the prophecy, Rome, is different. Because when you ask scholars and historians and theologians, what does Rome mean in this context? The answers divide into three very different directions, and the direction you choose changes everything. The oldest interpretation is the simplest. Rome means Rome, the city on the 7 hills. The Vatican, Italy, the eternal city from which the word Roman comes. Medieval Islamic scholars largely held this view, and there is a logic to it that is hard to dismiss. The prophet was drawing a parallel between two capitals. Constantinople was the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. Rome was the capital of the Western Roman Empire. One fell first. The other would fall second. It was a statement of geopolitical symmetry, the complete end of the Roman world, both East and West. For centuries after 1453, Muslim rulers and scholars expected the prophecy to be fulfilled literally. The Ottomans, fresh from taking Constantinople, turned their attention westward. Mehmed II himself launched a campaign into Italy in 1480. His forces landed at Otranto on the southern Italian coast and occupied the city for nearly a year. His death the following year ended the campaign. But the intention was clear. The prophecy pointed west. The city was Rome. The army was ready. It didn't happen. The literal conquest of Rome never came. Centuries passed. The Ottoman Empire expanded, and then contracted, and then collapsed. And the city of Rome still stands, with St. Peter's Basilica rising over it, and the Vatican's white walls gleaming in the Mediterranean sun. The literal interpretation remains alive. Some scholars today maintain it. The prophecy awaits a future Muslim army, a future leader, a future military event that will bring Islam to the gates of the eternal city. They point to the fact that prophecies can take centuries to unfold. Constantinople itself was prophesied in the 7th century and fulfilled in the 15th, 800 years. Rome has been standing as a target of this prophecy for over 500 years. By that measure, it's still early. The second interpretation is more complex, more modern, and, to many scholars, far more convincing. The argument goes like this. When the Prophet Muhammad said Constantinople, he didn't just mean one city. He meant the civilization that city represented. Constantinople was the heart of the Eastern Roman world. When it fell, an entire civilizational order collapsed with it. The Byzantine legal system, the Orthodox Church's political power, the Eastern Mediterranean trade networks, all of it restructured around the new Ottoman reality. If Constantinople meant a civilization, not just a city, then Rome means a civilization too. And the civilization of Rome is very much still alive. It did not die when the Western Empire fell in 476 AD. It transformed. It became the medieval Catholic Church, which preserved Roman law and Latin culture through the dark centuries. It became the Renaissance, which deliberately revived Roman art and philosophy. It became the Enlightenment, which built modern democracy on Roman republican ideals. It became Europe. And then, through European colonialism, it became America. The United States Capitol building is modeled on Roman architecture. American law is built on Roman legal tradition. The U.S. Senate is named after the Roman Senate. The American eagle echoes the Roman eagle. The very word Capitol comes from the Capitoline Hill in Rome. The civilization of Rome did not fall. It simply moved westward, across the Atlantic, and built a new empire with a new name. Under this interpretation, when the prophet said Rome, he was pointing at the entire inheritance of Western civilization: the European Union, the United States, the Anglo-American Alliance, NATO, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the United Nations Security Council. All of it, the entire architecture of the modern Western world order, is the Rome the prophecy is describing. And if that is true, then the question is not whether a Muslim army will ever march on the Vatican. The question is whether Western civilization as we know it will survive the century. The third interpretation is the quietest, and perhaps the most unsettling. What if the conquest described in the prophecy is not military at all? In Arabic, the word used in the Hadith is fath, which is often translated as conquest or victory, but which carries a broader meaning: an opening, a breakthrough, a liberation. When Islam spread to a new land in the early centuries, it was often described as fath, not only when armies conquered territory, but when hearts were opened and communities embraced the faith. Islam is today the fastest-growing religion in Europe. In France, an estimated 6 million Muslims now live, the largest Muslim population in Western Europe. In Germany, it is over 5 million. In Britain, nearly 4 million. In Sweden, the numbers have grown so rapidly that new mosques are being built in cities where none existed a generation ago. This growth is not driven by armies. It is driven by migration, by demographics, by conversion, by the simple fact that Muslim families in Europe tend to have more children than the secular European average. Within decades, certainly within this century, Islam will be a dominant social force in multiple European nations. Not through force, not through conquest in the military sense, but through the slow, undeniable weight of numbers and culture. Could this be the fath the prophet described? Not soldiers at the gates of Rome, but the call to prayer echoing from minarets in Paris and London and Berlin. Not flags planted on foreign soil, but the Quran being taught in schools where Latin grammar was once the curriculum. The scholars who hold this view are cautious. They acknowledge it is a minority interpretation, but they note that prophetic language is often broader than its literal surface, that a prophecy can contain layers of meaning that only become visible in hindsight. Perhaps all three interpretations are true. Perhaps they unfold at different times, in different forms, each one a chapter of the same story. What is certain is this: something is happening in the relationship between Islam and the West. And it was described with striking accuracy 2,400 years ago. The checklist: how empires die, and why it looks familiar. Let us set prophecy aside for a moment. Let us speak as historians, as people who study how great civilizations have ended, not based on religious texts, but based on the cold evidence of archaeology, economics, and political science. Because the historians have something important to tell us, and it doesn't require faith to hear it. They tell us that great empires do not fall suddenly. They fall slowly, then all at once. They hollow out from the inside over generations, structurally, morally, financially, until one day the wall that everyone assumed was solid turns out to be paper, and the whole thing collapses in an afternoon. They tell us that the process of collapse follows a recognizable pattern, and that pattern has repeated itself across history. In Rome, in Persia, in the Mongol Empire, in the British Empire, in the Soviet Union. The names change. The pattern does not. The pattern goes like this. Every empire that has ever collapsed was bankrupt before it fell. Rome in its final centuries debased its currency so severely that silver coins contained almost no silver. They were bronze coins with a thin silver coating, dipped and passed off as the real thing. The state needed more money than it could collect in taxes, so it printed more money, which made each coin worth less, which meant the state needed even more money to meet its obligations, which meant it printed still more, a death spiral that modern economists would recognize immediately. The United States national debt currently exceeds $36 trillion. That is a number so large, it is essentially meaningless to the human mind. $36,000 billion owed to bond markets, foreign governments, pension funds, and the Federal Reserve. Every year, the interest payments alone on this debt consume a larger portion of the federal budget. The money that once built highways and educated children and projected military power is increasingly being redirected to simply service the interest on yesterday's borrowing. This is not a political observation. It is a mathematical one. Debt compounds. Interest compounds. The trajectory of the numbers, examined without ideology, points in one direction. Roman senators in the 4th century probably told themselves the same things modern economists tell themselves today. That the situation is manageable. That growth will outpace the debt. That the empire is too important to fail. The coins kept losing their silver. The empire kept declining. And then, one day, a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer walked into Ravenna and told the last emperor it was over. At its height, the Roman Empire maintained legions along the Rhine, the Danube, the Euphrates, the Atlas Mountains, and Hadrian's Wall in northern Britain. The empire's borders were thousands of miles of frontier, each requiring garrisoning, supplying, and defending against peoples who had no intention of accepting Roman rule. The cost was ruinous. The manpower was finite. As the empire's finances declined, the quality of its legions declined too, increasingly filled with Germanic mercenaries whose loyalties were to their commanders and their pay, not to Rome itself. The army that was supposed to protect the empire became, in its final decades, a collection of warlords with increasingly Roman titles and decreasingly Roman values. The United States has maintained a military presence in over 170 countries. It has fought wars in Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, and dozens of smaller theaters since the end of the Second World War. The war in Afghanistan alone lasted 20 years and cost over $2 trillion by conservative estimates. ending not in victory, but in a chaotic withdrawal that left the exact same government in power that was there before the invasion began. This is not a criticism. It is an observation about the arithmetic of empire. There is only so much blood and treasure. When it runs out, or when the domestic population loses the will to keep spending it, the frontier contracts. The world notices, and the world adjusts. The Roman Senate in its final century was less a governing body than a theater of personal vendettas. Emperors were proclaimed and murdered with terrifying regularity. In the period known as the crisis of the 3rd century, Rome had over 20 emperors in 50 years, most of whom died violently. The political class was so consumed with destroying each other that the actual governance of the empire, the roads, the courts, the frontiers, was left to bureaucrats and generals who increasingly acted as independent powers. The Western political landscape today does not require much description. The divisions are visible to anyone with a television or a telephone. What is worth noting is not the division itself. Politics has always been contentious, but the specific character of the division. A loss of shared identity, a collapse of agreement on basic facts, a breakdown in the institutions that were supposed to manage disagreement peacefully. When a society can no longer agree on what it is, what it stands for, and what rules govern the resolution of its internal conflicts, it has entered the zone that historians recognize as pre-collapse. This doesn't mean collapse is imminent. It means the structural load-bearing capacity of the society is weakening. The walls are still standing, but they are no longer solid. In 1918, a German philosopher named Oswald Spengler published the first volume of a work called The Decline of the West. He was not a Muslim. He had read no Hadith. He was working entirely from his study of Western history, Western philosophy, and Western art. His thesis was stark. Western civilization was a living organism, and like all organisms, it had a lifespan. It had a spring, the early medieval period, a summer, the high medieval and Renaissance, an autumn, the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution, and a winter. Spengler believed he was writing from inside the winter. Not the beginning of winter, the deep winter, the phase of decline. He predicted that Western democracies would hollow out and be replaced by what he called Caesarism, rule by strong individual figures who bypass the old institutions, not through formal revolution, but through the gradual irrelevance of those institutions to the actual exercise of power. He predicted the rise of money as the supreme value, replacing older values of faith, honor, and civic duty. He predicted a growing separation between the cosmopolitan elite, connected, global, rootless, and a traditional population that felt dispossessed of its own culture. He wrote this in 1918. Scholars do not agree on everything Spengler said. He was wrong about some things and right about others, but the broad brushstrokes of his picture, drawn a century ago from purely secular sources, align with remarkable precision to what Islamic prophecy, drawn from the 7th century, described as the condition of the world before the final age. Two entirely different traditions, two entirely different methodologies, arriving at the same destination. That is not nothing. The scholars map what the learned have said about Rome. Ibn Kathir was born in 1301 in a small Syrian village and died in Damascus in 1373. In his lifetime, he lived through the Black Death, the Mongol invasions, and the political upheavals of the Mamluk Sultanate. He was one of the most prolific scholars in Islamic history. His commentary on the Quran alone runs to multiple volumes, and his historical work, The Beginning and the End, Al-Bidayah wa Al-Nihaya, remains one of the foundational texts of Islamic historiography. Ibn Kathir wrote about the Constantinople Rome prophecy. He wrote about it with complete seriousness, not as metaphor, not as allegory, but as a specific prediction about a future event that he fully expected to occur. He wrote before 1453. He never saw Constantinople fall in his lifetime, but he believed it would. He believed it because the prophet had said it would. He was right, and he believed Rome would follow. This matters enormously when we evaluate the prophecy. Ibn Kathir was not a credulous man. He was a rigorous scholar who applied strict standards of verification to the Hadith he accepted. The fact that he treated this prophecy as reliable and expected its fulfillment is not a small thing. It means the prophecy has been taken seriously by serious people for 7 centuries. Sheikh Imran Hossein is a contemporary scholar born in Trinidad who has spent decades in Islamic scholarship in Malaysia, the United States, and elsewhere. He is, among living scholars, the one who has most systematically applied the prophecies of the end times to modern geopolitics. His lectures, available freely online, have been watched tens of millions of times, from Kuala Lumpur to Cairo to Kansas City. His argument about Rome is this: the prophecy must be understood within the full framework of Islamic eschatology, the theology of the end times. And within that framework, the events are sequential. The false Messiah, the Dajjal, will appear. Imam Mahdi will emerge to lead the Muslim world in a time of unprecedented crisis. The Prophet Isa, Jesus peace be upon him, will return, and the great battles of the end times, including events connected to the Rome prophecy, will unfold in that context. But Sheikh Imran Hossein goes further. He argues that Rome in the Hadith refers specifically to the modern Anglo-American alliance, the United States, Britain, and their allies. He traces the inheritance of Roman civilization through European colonialism to the current Western world order, and argues that the decline and eventual fall of American hegemony is the conquest of Rome the Prophet Muhammad foretold. He also draws a direct line to Jerusalem. In his framework, the status of Jerusalem, the conflicts over it, the political battles about it, the military campaigns connected to it, is the central driver of the end times timeline. As Jerusalem becomes the flashpoint, the countdown accelerates. We live in a world where Jerusalem is the single most contested piece of territory on the planet. Every world power has been forced to take a public position. The United Nations has debated it more than any other issue in its history. Wars have been fought over it, are being fought over it, will be fought over it. Sheikh Imran Hossein has been saying for 3 decades that this moment was coming. He is not the only one. From Malaysia to Morocco, from Pakistan to Indonesia, serious Islamic scholars are saying the same thing in different words. We are inside the story now. We are not watching it from outside. We are characters in it. It is important to note that these concerns are not only raised within Islamic scholarship. Graham Allison, a professor at Harvard's Kennedy School and former Assistant Secretary of Defense, published a book in 2017 called Destined for War, examining the historical pattern of what happens when a rising power challenges a dominant one. He called it the Thucydides trap, named after the ancient Greek historian who observed that it was the rise of Athens and the fear it caused in Sparta that made the Peloponnesian War inevitable. Allison identified 16 cases in the past 500 years where a rising power challenged a dominant one. 12 of those cases ended in war. He was describing the dynamic between the United States and China. But the framework applies more broadly. When civilizational orders shift, when the dominant power of an era begins to lose its dominance, the transition is almost never peaceful. It is almost always accompanied by conflict, instability, and the restructuring of the entire world order. Harvard professors and 7th-century prophets are not usually found in the same paragraph. But here we are. The door still closed. What has not happened yet? We must be honest. For all the signs, for all the parallels, for all the convergence between prophecy and current events, the second part of the Hadith has not been fulfilled. Rome has not fallen. No blessed commander has been named. No blessed army has assembled. The Western world is wounded, perhaps, and weakening by many measures, but it is not conquered. Not yet. And Islamic scholarship is clear about where the Rome prophecy sits within the larger sequence of the end times. It does not come first. The Islamic tradition distinguishes between minor signs and major signs of the end times. The minor signs are many, some scholars list over 100, and they include conditions and events that gradually increase in severity as the final age approaches. The major signs are a smaller set of specific, unmistakable events that mark the beginning of the end itself. The major signs, according to the scholarly consensus, include the appearance of the Dajjal, the Antichrist, the greatest deceiver in human history, a figure whose trial will be the most severe test humanity has ever faced, the emergence of Imam Mahdi, the guided leader who will unite the fractured Muslim world and lead it through the darkest chapter. The return of the Prophet Isa, peace be upon him, Jesus, son of Mary, who will descend from the heavens and lead humanity in the final age. And the appearance of Gog and Magog, the two forces whose release will cover the earth. None of these major signs have appeared. Not one. Which means, within the scholarly framework, the Rome prophecy, which is connected to events in this sequence, is still some way off. The architecture of the end times has preconditions. The story has chapters, and we have not yet reached the chapter where Rome falls. When the Prophet Muhammad said Constantinople would be conquered, the walls of that city had already been standing for 200 years. They would stand for 800 more. The prophecy sat dormant, believed, preserved, transmitted, across those centuries, waiting for the conditions that would allow its fulfillment. 800 years is a long time, but within the frame of prophecy, it is nothing. It is a held breath. The scholars who have studied the minor signs most carefully, Ibn Kathir, Al-Nawawi, Al-Qurtubi, and in the modern era Sheikh Imran Hossein and others, note that the minor signs do not merely increase in number as the end times approach. They accelerate. The pace of fulfillment quickens. Events that took centuries to unfold begin to unfold in decades. Events that took decades begin to unfold in years. If that pattern holds, and the scholars argue it does, then the fact that we are living in a time of extraordinary historical acceleration is itself a sign. The technological revolution, the collapse of old geopolitical orders, the redrawing of maps, the resurgence of religious identity in an era that was supposed to be secular. All of it happening at a speed that previous generations could not have imagined. The door is still closed, but the sound coming from behind it is not silence. Something is building. What it means for us. Living inside the prophecy. There is a temptation, when reading prophecies about the fall of great powers, to feel a kind of satisfaction. A sense that justice is being served, that the powerful will one day face their reckoning, that history bends toward accountability. That temptation should be resisted. The prophet was not celebrating destruction when he spoke these words. The Hadith says the commander is blessed and the army is blessed. This is a statement about the spiritual condition of those who fulfill the prophecy, not a call for gleeful anticipation of someone else's suffering. Millions of ordinary people live within the civilization that these prophecies concern. They are not abstractions. They are human beings, with families, with fears, with the same hope for peace and stability that all people share. The correct response to prophecy is not triumphalism. It is sobriety. It is a recognition that the events of history are not random. They are not merely the product of economic forces and military power and the decisions of politicians. There is a script. It was written before we arrived, and it will continue after we leave. Our job, individually, as believers, is not to celebrate the script or despair over it, but to understand it clearly enough to know where we are within it and how to live accordingly. What does it mean to live inside a prophecy? It means, first, that we should not be surprised. The events unfolding in the world today, the wars, the economic instability, the political chaos, the crumbling of old certainties, should not shock the believer who has read and understood the prophecies. The prophet described this world. He prepared those who listened for it. Surprise is the condition of those who did not listen. It means, second, that we should not be paralyzed. Prophecy is not fatalism. The fact that history has a destination does not mean that nothing we do matters. Within the story, our choices are real. Our actions have consequences. The believers who will be described as the blessed army when the time comes will be blessed because of who they are and how they lived, not because their names were written on a list somewhere. They will be blessed because they built, across their lives, the spiritual and moral character that makes them worthy of being part of something significant. And it means, third, that we should pay attention. The scholars who study these prophecies are not doing so as an academic exercise. They are doing so because the signs are visible, not in the abstract, but in the specific, daily news cycle of the world we live in. The student of prophecy reads the newspaper differently from anyone else. Every headline is a potential data point. Every geopolitical shift is a potential chapter in a story that began 1,400 years ago. Constantinople was called the city protected by God. For 800 years, that protection held. And then, one morning in May 1453, the protection was lifted, and the walls that had seemed eternal came down in hours. The prophet knew it would happen. He said it 800 years before it did. He also said Rome comes next. We don't know the commander's name yet. We don't know the army. We don't know the year. We don't know exactly what Rome will look like when the moment comes, whether it will be a city, a civilization, a political order, or something else entirely that we don't yet have language to describe. We only know that the first half of the prophecy was fulfilled with perfect precision after 8 centuries of waiting. We only know that the world around us, examined honestly, without ideology, whether through the lens of Islamic scholarship or Western secular history, is showing every sign of a civilizational order in its final chapters. We only know that the door is still closed, but we have heard what happens when it opens. O Allah, show us truth as truth and grant us the ability to follow it. Wallahu a'lam, and Allah knows best.